if you've noticed like a shift at all in how people perceive or evaluate code switched conversations, whether written text versus oral, those different factors and how that might impact research outcomes.
Thank you. So the different contexts of code switching. So I am researching children's books and depictions of Spanish and translanguage in code switching in books. And what we found is that when code switching is used in these books, is usually in the context of home, right? Or in informal context. Like teachers in this study, they said that it's okay as long as it's not in a formal setting. But once you enter into the classroom, you have to stick to one language. So this kind of very strict language separation that code switching is okay within my family, friends, informal. Then formal settings require one language, even when the speakers in that context are multilingual. So part of it will be fantastic to see why, right? Like the reasons for, even though you were modeling it, maybe it's so ingrained, right? Like maybe it's just these perceptions that you're going to think that I do not speak the language well enough. There is a professor, she was part of my committee, her name is Guadalupe Valdez. She retired recently from Stanford. And she used to say that if she makes a mistake speaking English, she knew that she was going to be judged not only by making that mistake, but her entire experience as a professor. Like her expertise will be questioned, right? So if I make a mistake speaking English and I conjugate the verb in a wrong way, then it's not, oh, he made a mistake. It's more like, is he really well prepared? Where did he study? Does he have a PhD? Can he write? So all of these additional judgments that like kind of you need to justify your space when you come from non-traditional backgrounds. And not just multilingual backgrounds, but we were just saying like, if you're a first generation student, you're always having to defend your place here. And you're always having to understand, how do I fit here? What are the norms? And if for some reason you think I am not matching them, then you start self-doubting yourself. And those self-doubts don't allow you to enact your identity, because you think, how is that going to be perceived in this kind of more formal space? So it is like the psychological connections between language and identity, how we present ourselves, and these conflicts that we have. I do not know. Like, for example, when I go and teach, I think, well, should I be using another variety of Spanish? But if I do, so I have these internal conflicts myself. That research about this constant negotiation and accepting the conflict of created by these spaces is, I think, worth studying and worth accepting.
You said you had two types of questions. Would the teacher correct the student if the content was language versus if it was science or something else? Mm-hmm. Did you notice any differences in whether or not they would correct it based on the teaching context?
Think about the idea first, but still think they were very conscious that that idea should be expressed in correct language, right? What is happening now, and this is an area that if you're interested in education, I really encourage you to do that, is that, for example, many of these dual language schools across the nation, they ask to teach, for example, science in Spanish. Now, when you teach, let's say, photosynthesis in Spanish, if one student doesn't get it, is it because the concept is hard or is the language that is hard? So this entangling, so what is the complication here? Like, is it a linguistic issue, or is it more a conceptual issue? And how can we support the students in those kind of these intersections, right? So in our study, we were not exploring that. We were trying to say, let's assume that it's a science idea and that you got it, that you understood what the student was trying to say, even though it was mentioned in this or used or expressed in this other variety. But teachers really care about the language variety or the correctness of how that idea was expressed. So but other studies, so for example, that study would be wonderful to say, okay, so how can we separate the effect of the complexity of the concept from the effect of the language?
my students spoke Spanish continuously in my classes, and if they made mistakes in English, I didn't correct their grammar because I didn't want to discourage them. But I was an English teacher. To what extent was my place to make everyone feel accepted and comfortable?
Finding a balance, right? What I don't find is spaces that offer times in which only English, and this is why we use it and why we learn it, and other times in which we're going to focus on just the different varieties. Like, I don't think we have to choose one or the other. I think, for example, having a multilingual space, like let's say that we teach in schools 5 days a week, that out of those 5, maybe 3 are teaching the standard, focusing on the standard varieties, and 2 in which we read works that celebrate multilingualism. And then we have conversations about choices of varieties, right? And why do you think the speaker, like Juno Diaz, or these authors who purposefully incorporate words and expressions from the Dominican, right? In Latin America, we say, I'm going to throw you the chancla, right? Te voy a lanzar la chancla. Like, I am going to throw you the sandal, like moms say, like. So it says moms, when they get upset at you, they take the sandal and choom. The thing is, in Latin America, you wouldn't say, I am going to throw you the sandal. Te voy a tirar la sandalia. It doesn't express as, si te tiro la chancla, that has a very particular, even though chancla and sandalia mean the exact same thing, is choices, right? And Mandy, like the expression that you told me from your professor from Kim Potowski, that Kim Potowski, Mandy told me, I didn't know, she said, in weddings, we dress in a certain way that is appropriate. So, but when we go to the beach, we could not go to the beach dressed in a formal attire because we will be hot, we will not be accepted, we will look different, right? So, but having kind of these choices that we make to express our linguistic identities, and that is in our control versus imposed by society, like my own agency. When I speak this variety, is because I am choosing to use it to represent myself in an academic setting. But I can also use a different variety when I am with my friends at the beach, and then I do it, and it's my choice, right? So exposing students and teaching them about, so English has all of these varieties. One of them has been centered as the standard, by no means is the natural, better variety. But, and then let's talk about other ones. So, but having those spaces and those honest conversations in which we are not ignoring them, because what happens is, so there is this professor at UIC, Danny Morales Doyle. He does science education in the south side of Chicago. And he says sometimes when we do, he focuses on critical race theory, cultural and relevant theory, education. He says sometimes in science education, we think that when we address social issues, we are watering down the curriculum. We are not focusing on the science, that these students should learn chemical equations. And if we were to say, but these communities are suffering the effects of these chemical plants here, then suddenly you are not talking about the science, you're talking about social issues, and that is not science. Versus, he was saying, one of the most important precepts of culturally responsive education is to first identify and for your students to succeed academically. That is one, like you want their students to succeed academically, and then, but not at the expense of their repertoires or their knowledges or experiences. So finding those spaces, I think, is, and finding ways on doing that in ways that cover the curriculum, which is another, because you need to cover standards, you need to cover content, and how to do that, I think, is just these conversations in which how do we do it, right, in a way like you did it. So I think you did well.
What do you think about in terms of assessment? Because was that test like the access test, the state test, or was it the classroom assessments that they were also saying which you have to do well on?
It was. Thank you for the question. It was the standard Texas test, a test, over there is called the STAR test, but it was the Spanish test. Again, I am not saying let's get rid of Spanish from Spain or from Latin America. What I'm saying is, for example, one of the topics in the units that they had to read was about El Quijote de la Mancha. How is it in English?
Don Quixote, yeah.
Don Quixote,
yeah.
right? And these kids were born and raised in Texas, and they were learning about El Quijote de la Mancha, right? So I was wondering, couldn't they read about Pancho Villa or something? Like, if it's about the Spanish, right, at least make it relevant to the realities here. But again, I think that we still use this exonormative in terms of what is taught, what is tested, that going back to these spaces, I don't think it would be bad to test like this code switching and then also test standard Spanish. So I don't think we have to choose. How to arrive to a good balance in which we can do both effectively and productively, I think that will require a lot of work. In which, for example, a test that reflects this linguistic diversity, in which is still centered around the standard Spanish perhaps, but it still has some sections that say, okay, in Texas, carpet is called carpeta. Truck is called troca. So if you go in Texas, I was telling my son, don't go and tell them, all of you are wrong. Don't call it carpeta, call it alfombra, because they will ignore you forever and ever. So you cannot correct the community of speakers. So you have to accept that the language is used in that way, and kind of in some way, which I do not know how, reflected informal spaces. That in here, for example, we have at least one of the classes a week in which we use Chicano Spanish, right? Or we discuss how is Chicano Spanish different from standard Spanish? And then what does that mean by that? Like, how do we feel it by including it? Do you feel represented or not? Having these conversations with the students and seeing the effects on testing and that, yeah. From this presentation, I just want you to, like this idea of complexity, that is not as easy as we think it is to say, this is the Spanish, this is the English, these are the English learners, the Spanish learners, because all of these linguistic histories, like these linguistic trajectories that each of us has lived through, like these experiences in teaching in the Bronx, which is a complete different set of, Dominican Spanish and all of those things. So to reflect on how do we do this, and when we do it, like what type of messages are we sending, right? Like when I correct my bilingual teachers in Wisconsin, then I think, would they want to become a bilingual teacher if they think their Spanish is not good enough? And then is it backfiring, or are we really promoting bilingualism? And if so, how are we constantly thinking about how to do it? So thank you very much. Thank you.